Day one, Jojima's Summer of Love. I think I mentioned earlier that I was about 9 years old when there was the original Summer of Love in San Francisco. And I lived just a few miles across the Bay Bridge from the big hoopla. I remember my uncle taking me for a ride through Haight-Ashbury and on our way to the Sunset District, which is where my grandparents live. So I was kind of not living in it, but right next to the intentionality of that summer of love. We were in the middle of the Vietnam War. We had just discovered that the government had been lying to us. So there were protests. UC Berkeley was like ground zero for a lot of those protests. So the whole Bay Area was really, being worked by this question of, do we really have to go to war again and again and again and again? And do we really have to live in such aggravated culture? And so it touched me, and I wished I'd been older. I was too young for Woodstock. I was too young for the hippie movement. I was too young for the psychedelics movement. Plus the family story I was born into. None of those were woven into my story in the early years, but there was a seed that was planted in me when I was just a child. Remembering my mother's reaction to Martin Luther King's and JFK's and Bobby Kennedy's assassinations. And so there's, these informed so much of my inquiry about life. And I jumped in to the closest thing I could find for a seeker to get answers, and that was religion. This is kind of a funny part of the story. I was baptized Catholic, and we weren't real active in the church, but we went on Christmas and Easter, and my aunt was pretty devout, and so it was still pretty thick thread in the family story. And yet I just could not get into the whole pomp and circumstance. It just didn't feel right to me. And so as a teenager, about age 12, I was invited to go to a church camp for an evangelical Christian church. And I thought, these are kind of my people. They sing, they dance, they do cool stuff. They have lay preachers and pastors. And that felt closer to a truth for me, that the message doesn't come from some person on high. It comes to all of us. And the pastor's role was just to help us learn to navigate our way to that truth. And I was away at church camp, and a whole bunch of young people my age were getting baptized in the swimming pool. And I thought, well, this is kind of cool. I'd like to do this too. I like this whole Jesus and God thing. And I just hadn't found a church that lined up yet. So I thought this was it. So the youth pastor sat me down. He says, well, we have to get permission from your parents. And I called my mom. I said, Mom, I want to get baptized. And she goes, you've already been baptized. And I said, okay, hang on a minute. I looked up the youth pastor. I said, I've already been baptized. And he says, it's not good enough. You have to be baptized, full immersion. Catholics just do the sprinkling of the water on the head. That's not a real baptism. It has to be a John the Baptist baptism. I was like, okay, Mom, I got to go deep. She goes, okay. So I get baptized into the evangelical Christian church, and it takes about 2 years of engagement, and I begin to see the edge that I saw it in the Catholic Church. I saw it in the Christian church, this edge about you have to live a certain way, believe a certain belief, follow a certain dogma, adhere to a certain doctrine in order to get to heaven. And everything was about the reward at the end, and not about who we were right here and now. And that didn't sit well with me. See, Catholics have this thing that you're born a sinner and you got to work your whole life to get out of that mess. The evangelicals were kind of like, saved by grace, saved by Christ. Okay, so they had a bit of a, they didn't really talk about how you were born a sinner, yeah, but there was a get out of jail free card. And not at the end of your life, just at the moment you took Jesus as your savior. So that was an interesting path, but then it was always about, well, we have to go get everybody else to do this too, or they're going to hell. And I was like, oh man, this heaven hell thing. just doesn't line up. It didn't. And I was already like, at that time, there was news stories about orphans in Russia failing to thrive because of a lack of connection, a lack of love, a lack of physical touch. And I began to really understand that our biology was the greatest teacher of what we needed as human beings to thrive. And I thought, if there is a God, he or she, they, us, didn't really have a clear sort of masculine patriarchal attachment to that story. I was more sort of in the inquiry of all that. I thought, well, no, this, our way or the highway didn't feel right to me. If there is a God, he looks at our heart, she looks in our heart and knows that we're seeking and we're trying to understand. And so a few years later, a dear friend of mine in high school was Mormon. He took me to some Mormon gatherings and Mormon seminary in the morning, and the donuts were great. The kids were fun. The teacher was awesome. But it didn't grab a hold of me. But they did have one piece of doctrine that that you're born perfect, that children are born perfect, and that all children were just these beautiful buds waiting to bloom under the care of amazing parents. And I had, and this will come in another part of our story here, some hard things in my childhood, and I didn't feel like my parents were really up to the game of raising the four of us. And so I saw these beautiful big Mormon families, and mom and dad, and everybody was hanging out together, and Monday nights. And so it sort of began to work me. And my friend went off and did his mission and came home, and we ran into each other on a fluke. And 3 months later, we were married, and I was baptized. And that baptized thing, this is the part that I probably should have said, wait a minute, again? But so when you become Mormon, you have to be baptized again. Another John the Baptist full immersion baptism. And I said, I've already done that. I've done the sprinkle. I've done the evangelical baptism, the John the Baptist already. Why do I have to do this again? They said, because ours is the one true church. Oh, and I look back now, and what was I thinking? Except I love the guy, and I love the people, and I love the community. Community became really an important part of my pursuit of connection to others, and so I became Mormon, and I went all the way down the rabbit hole of temple worthy Mormon, tithing Mormon, garment wearing Mormon, secret handshake Mormon, secret temple name Mormon. And I'll probably go to hell for saying this, but you're given a name in the Mormon church when you go through and you get your endowments, your special blessings and underwear that you wear all the time. And so by me saying this out loud right here, I'm going to hell according to their doctrine. My name is Lydia. And when my husband, now ex-husband, meets me at the veil and calls my name, then I get to go across and have my own planet and like kids and millions, like give birth to an existence. And all that was pretty fanciful, but I was in pursuit of truth. I was in pursuit of the answers that we all have. Like, why are we here? What are we here to do? What is this human existence? It's just part of the story, right? That we're born with this inquiry in us, and some will chase it down lots of rabbit holes, as I did, and others will have a passing relationship with that inquiry. But I believe that it's baked into all of us to wonder, who am I? Why am I here? What is my purpose? And so I worked hard as a Mormon. I took your food supply and ground my own wheat and baked my own bread and taught Sunday school for 14 years. And without going into too much detail, my marriage did not finish as well as it started. And my husband had decided to continue dating after we had been married. And so at about 14 years out, I realized this was not the path for me. And I left the church and my ex-husband on the same day, became a single mom with 4 kids. Starting over, no college degree, because I was going to be a full-time mom. Like I really bought that script about life in that way. And so it was not until a few years after that, 2001, when I had a pulmonary embolism and died. And when I was on the other side, out of my body, all I felt was love and light. There were no pearly gates, no heaven, hell, no judgment, no fear. And yet so much of the religion that I had been taught and as a Sunday school tried hard to teach in a loving way was about fear. And I realized that any belief that's based in fear probably is not going to line up with our biology. We're not wired for fear. Fear is an important tool of reaction, but it is not. We're wired for love. We fail to thrive without love and connection. We do not fail to thrive without fear. So when I couldn't reconcile those two things. And so when I came out of that experience, that near-death experience, I was left with one question. I was given a choice to come back or be done. And obviously my choice as a parent, I'm here. But the words that kept working me is, you've not yet consented to the human experience. It's like, wow, what does that mean? Not yet consented fully, completely to the human experience. And so for the next decade, that worked me. It caused me to think about what I would want to consent to, what kind of life I would really be excited to live, what kind of role, purpose, activities, way of being that I would want to say yes to. Where is the big yes in this human experience? And I'd had a big yes with motherhood. Love being a mom, love my children. They're my best friends at this point in my life. No regrets there. But there was more. There was more. I was so much of my life was in reaction to a fear of scarcity, a fear of judgment. I didn't realize how much fear was the driving force in my human narrative. And I think a lot of us are just now starting to realize how much fear has caused us to take jobs we didn't love, but we were afraid because we needed to make money. We went and had relationships with people that didn't serve us, like so many ways of self-abandonment and self-betrayal, and all of it based in fear of judgment, fear of not fitting in, fear of not being good enough, like the list, we all have it, right? And so I began to really think about, well, what would I consent to? What would life look like? And this idea of consenting to the human experience, with a pulmonary embolism, I couldn't breathe, right? So breath has become a major point of awareness for me, my own breath. And I spent the next decade really thinking about what it means to breathe, to be here, to want to be here in this human plane. And I thought about breath, that life begins with breath and ends with a final breath. And that's sort of an implied consent to the human experience. But then there is a point somewhere along the timeline where you take an explicit breath of yes to the human experience and no longer resist the trials and tribulations of life. You also become aware of how you are creating your own trauma drama from unresolved trauma in your childhood, and you start to take responsibility for your own human experience. And it was little bits at a time, like no more self-betrayal, setting better boundaries, saying no to situations and people that did not feel good in my nervous system. And I began to recognize my nervous system as my inner GPS. If I really slowed down, took a breath, and didn't react, but instead, as Viktor Frankl would say, take a moment between stimulus and response, I would find that my nervous system had an answer that was sometimes different than my fear-based reaction to things. So I would slow down, take a breath, and my nervous system just kept leading me little bit by little bit till I don't even know what day it happened, but I realized I'd reached a tipping point where I really wanted to be here. I really wanted to have a full ride human experience. I wanted to experience me all in on the human experience. And so I'll just leave these thoughts with you, little bits, little seeds. Have you consented to the human experience? Have you said yes? No more resisting, wishing it was different, asking for something other than what it is. Are you in that place where you have surrendered your fear of this big, grand JOJI, joy of joining in experiment that we're in? And if not, why not? What is getting in the way of your consent, your yes to life as it is? And I invite you to sit with that, because what's coming next is a moment of collective consent, a choice point for the human story to shift in a new direction. And so I'm going to talk more about the collective choice point over these 90 days and the joy of joining in on that collective choice point, the joy of joining in on breathing together. And I'll talk more about that too. But for today, I just want you to think about, this is the first of 90 days that I have consented to show up raw, uncensored, just me talking to you, inviting you to have a healing conversation about the human experiment. May it be so. Aho.